Here we are again. No metropolis in the background today. Just birds singing. The sun's out, spring's round the corner, and the flowers are beginning to bud as the earth warms up. Because that's the key to the transition between winter and spring, is as the earth warms, everything comes alive. Now, if you're lucky, you'll see some hares in the background, but most likely you won't, because they're pretty frisky little characters. Now, the subject I'm going to broach today is a little bit unpleasant, but it highlights what happens in a so-called liberal democracy when protests are effective. Now, what we saw happen to the construction, forest, mining and energy unions through a legislative agenda which basically made striking illegal and which made individual members responsible for payments of fines of up to $10,000 a day for being involved in what's described as a strike or withdrawal of labour outside an enterprise bargaining agreement. That same legislative agenda is now being introduced around the country at the state level initially regarding protests against the protests to highlight the climate emergency. Now, we saw this recently in New South Wales, where legislation was passed through both houses of Parliament which criminalises behaviour, protest behaviour. And we saw a few hundred people involved in the blockade Australia protests in Sydney have the full force of the law thrown at them. Not only do we see helicopters descending on camps with 20 or 30 people, police in paramilitary uniforms raiding camps, but we saw the legislative arm of that physical confrontation, where laws have been introduced which basically criminalises peaceful behaviour. So protests which were commonplace in the 60s and 70s have now become criminal activities, where huge fines are imposed on people, where legislation is put in place which brings back the old consorting laws, which prevents people from getting together while waiting court cases which can take months and years in some cases. So the presumption that we're innocent before we're found guilty in a court of laws is thrown out the doors. So these are the type of laws which were used to break up criminal behaviour is now being used to break up protest activity, which highlights the business as usual approach which is taken by this country as far as the climate emergency is concerned will not resolve these issues. Taking a leaf out of the New South Wales legislation, the Victorian Parliament will soon pass legislation which is passed through the Legislative Assembly in the Legislative Council, which imposes the same restrictions on people involved in forestry protests. Now, you need to remember that in Victoria, although the milling companies are privately owned, Vic Forest, which cuts the timber and provides it for the highly subsidised milling companies, and we're talking about old growth forests here, is 100% owned by the Victorian government. 100% owned. So we have this dying industry based around old growth forests, where the state is now introducing legislation which will penalise protesters up to $20,000 a day for entering coops of timber before they're logged, to determine whether there are any timbers there which shouldn't be cut. Obviously, this legislation is being pushed before the state election in order to shore up votes in those areas for the state government for this dying subsidised industry. It's not only about fines, it'll be about jail sentences, laws which prevent people from communicating with each other, although they're not technically guilty of any offence, although they may have been arrested in a logging coop. It's not even about blockades. It's about preventing people entering these coops. And let's not remember, these are state-run forests. These are not privately owned forests. These are on crowned land. So what we are seeing, as we saw 20 years ago, during the hysteria surrounding the terrorist phase, where we saw legislation which was introduced which criminalised normal protest activity, where people involved in a peaceful occupation can be jailed for up to 25 years, where if you're inadvertently in possession of material or information which may assist the authorities in their investigations, you can be hauled off the streets, held in secret for up to 5 days, questioned, and if you refuse to answer questions, you can be charged and jailed for up to 5 years. So we saw these laws then extended into the CFMEU, and now we're seeing similar laws extended into protest activity regarding the climate emergency. Now, a lot of people think that we live in a democratic society where the individual is protected against the arbitrary exercise of state power. And that is the basis of conversation, especially during elections. And we're seeing a Victorian state election coming up on the 28th of November and a state election coming up in New South Wales, I think in March 2023. So we have this conversation that we have freedom of speech, constitutionally, freedom of association, freedom of movement. And we saw during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when antivirals and vaccinations were not available, we saw that the extraordinary powers that the state governments were able to exercise. Now, I have no issues with mandates regarding highly communicable diseases which can cause extensive death in a period where there are no treatments or protections. But using the same principles and laws to prevent peaceful protest highlights the extent the government will go to in order to quell protests. The fact is, constitutionally, they have this power. The difference between Australia and every other liberal democracy in the Western world, and we like to compare ourselves to the rest of the Western world, is the fact that we have no constitutional protections for the individual apart from freedom of religion and the right to fair compensation to land which is compulsorily acquired by the government of the day. We have no rights under the Australian Constitution, and this allows both states and federal governments to pass any legislation they like as long as they've got a majority in both houses of Parliament. So while they talk about the Third Amendment and the right to free speech in the United States of America, there is no talk about those rights. Even the right to free speech doesn't exist in the Australian Constitution. The High Court found over 20 years ago it's an implied right which only exists during parliamentary elections, because you can't have a parliamentary election without the right to free speech, and they had to find an implied right in the Australian Constitution. And if you think you have the right to freely associate, you don't. Under the current federal legislation, the Attorney General of the day can ban any organisation he or she thinks or believes may pose a threat. And we're not talking about a physical threat, we're talking about an economic threat, or a threat in terms of the normal business attitude which we currently have. So obviously we are now entering a difficult phase, an exceptionally difficult phase, because let's be realistic. People involved in protests, although they are at the spearhead of change, and without that protest, those ideas would not be part and parcel of everyday conversation and push for changes in legislation. The fact is, the people involved in protest are a minuscule minority. And it's very, very easy to marginalise and criminalise a minuscule minority, especially when you have a corporate-owned media and a government-gelded ABC, which continues to push the mantra that we live in a society with freedom of association, freedom of speech. So it is an important juncture we find ourselves in, because if we criminalise protest activity, the only activity which will be carried out is everyday existence, activity which doesn't threaten, that's activity that doesn't threaten the interests, the economic interests of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and activity that doesn't threaten the so-called decision-making powers in our society. Because ultimately, we don't live in a democratic society, a society where it's the rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged population. We basically live in a society where the population is not engaged or politicised. And the only time we actually look at issues is when we as a society are forced to look at issues. Look at the current debate surrounding First Nations people. Look at the debate regarding reconciliation, the debate regarding a voice to Parliament, the debate regarding compensation, the debate regarding treaty. It took a long time and a lot of effort and a lot of energy to bring those issues forward, and even now we are only at the conversation phase of those issues. It's the same with the climate emergency. We have had 10 to 15 years of no activity, and now we're beginning on that journey at a snail's pace. Look at the issue regarding inequality in this society and how inequality has grown significantly. When 1/3 of the population lives on a social security benefit which is below the poverty line, you know that we have issues, especially with increasing interest rates and inflation. Because increasing rates and inflation do not just affect people who own property or have loans with banks and financial institutions. It has the greatest effect on those with the least. So we have a constrained debate in this country about what is important. Occasionally, an issue-orientated debate will come forward and changes will be made. But as far as the basic way this society is structured, where power lies, where wealth is, who holds wealth in this country, there is no debate, and there will be no debate with the introduction of these draconian laws which prevent people from expressing opinions outside talking. Now, I can talk to the cows come home currently because I'm not a threat. These little conversations, or I should say monologues, it's a one-way conversation, are a threat to no one. What they do is they raise ideas, they raise issues, and they raise ways which we can tackle these issues. The situation will deteriorate as far as people like myself being able to speak, let alone being able to protest, as the pressure we put on the parliamentary puppets and that small section of society that owns the means for production, distribution, exchange and communication, the 8% who are part of the investment class, the legal system, the paramilitary police forces and the armed forces increases on a daily basis. That's when you will see, as we see in communist China and Putin's Russia, where even this small freedom, the freedom to freely express opinions, is removed because there is no constitutional protection in this country to freedom of speech and people freely expressing opinions which go contrary to the opinions which are held by those who exercise authority in this country. If you're interested in pursuing these ideas at a political level, at a parliamentary level, then I encourage you to join public interests before corporate interests.